Elm Trees, Past, Present and Future, presented by Peter Shallcross, dairy farmer and head of Tisbury Natural History Society. Elm trees have been part of our landscape for thousands of years, and their story is closely bound up with ours. In this talk, Peter will introduce the complex and fascinating story of elm trees in our landscape, and ultimately give us hope for their future.
So I've been interested in elms for probably 40 years. I used to live in the New Forest. We moved here as a family on the farm in 1981, and I brought 3 elms with me. This was for the white letter hairstreak, so I was thinking ahead. And one of those trees is still alive and is now a big tree. So I've always had it in the background. But it's only recently I really became involved with the disease-resistant elms. So the picture on this slide is an English elm. And this is what people miss in the landscape. You've got that very typical shape, the waist, the billowing at the top, an extraordinary tall tree, 45 meters tall. So this size of tree has all but disappeared in the UK. So the group that I'm part of is a very loose group, a loose group of individuals, of locals and not so locals. So Frank Crozier lives locally, and he's in charge of the propagation from cuttings of various types. Andrew Brooks is Mr. Elm, and he's pictured on the. This is Andrew here. This is Frank, and that's myself, a bit more hairy, even more hairy than now. So Andrew Brooks has been working since the 1970s, the last Dutch elm disease outbreak, and he's got a trial plantation of elms, which are some of which are very big, the oldest of the particular types in Britain. Mike Lockwood works on Salisbury Plain. He's very interested. He does a lot of propagating. Myself, and we're loosely associated with butterfly conservation because of the white letter hairstreak. So this is going to be the basis of the talk. First, run through the species, local examples of extraordinary survivors, a bit about the disease itself, white letter hairstreak, how we breed resistant elms, and what is the resistance, and how they're bred. And I'd like to say I'm not an expert on elm. I won't use lots of scientific names. My expertise lies in buying and selling resistant elms, but I've absorbed a lot of knowledge on the way. So the species of elms we have in the country, we have the wych elm, which is our only 100% native elm. So that's the one that people know came after the Ice Age and spread across the country. And it's still found in large numbers in the west and the north of Britain. It is susceptible to Dutch elm disease. And then the one we're familiar is Ulmus minor, the field elm, or the small-leaved elm. And it's very, very variable elm. People have had huge battles between different experts on classifying the different forms of the English elm, and it still hasn't been sorted out. So I'm not going to go into that field. I'll explain a little bit about the problems with them. But to give 2 examples, we've got the English elm here, which was probably bought by the Romans as a stay for their vineyards, and it's been spread by farmers later on in the enclosures, but I'll come on to that. And another example is the Plots elm, which is a very tall, erect elm found in Lincolnshire, that area. We've also got the European white elm, which is not a native, but has been here for maybe 500 years. And this is in a different genus to all the other ones I'm going to talk about tonight. And then to give an example of an imported elm, the Siberian elm has been planted widely, and it forms quite a lot of the basis for hybridization to produce resistant elms. And then to complicate matters, we've got lots of, well, innumerable hybrids. So many of you might have heard of the Huntington elm, which is documented on when and where that started off, when it was first hybridized and then sold through a nursery widely. I think we've covered the other ones here. So the wych elm, it's very difficult to classify elms, and there's some general sort of characteristics. So so it's got red flowers, which is a characteristic of most elms, very distinctive in the spring. The flowers come before the leaves, and it forms quite a small, a bushy kind of tree. They can get, I don't know, 10 meters or more tall. There's a really good picture in Robin Walter, his book in Living with Trees, of a huge wych elm in Malmesbury in the town centre. So they can grow big, but they're generally wider and less tall than the English elm. Whoops. Although it's quite small, the timber has been used widely in furniture making. All elms, the wood is resistant to water, and it's been the other elms particularly been used for building. And it's got a lot of other uses, for example, medicinal uses, and the seeds are edible. So this is the field elm, Ulmus minor, and in the picture are the typical suckers. These are on Semley Common. So far, these haven't been diseased, but they're typical of the size that the suckers get before they're knocked back by the disease. So wych elm doesn't sucker, so that's a characteristic. The English elm, the field elms do sucker widely, and this is how they reproduce. They don't produce very much viable seed, and it's thought that they only actually are able to do that once every 30 or 40 years. So they mostly in the wild they produce suckers, and man has either taken root cuttings or cuttings of the twigs to spread them around the countryside. So it's the most polymorphic of our elms, very difficult to classify. Brian Eversham in Cambridgeshire has documented about 40 Cambridge elms, different types of Ulmus minor, which are differentiated enough to give them names. So he's actually given them species names, but really most academics think that they're simply clones, and they've arisen over thousands of years. And because they can't produce seed, they remain true to the same form, producing suckers which produce the same characteristic tree, or they've been moved around by man for timber use. And again, they form the same characteristic tree. So it's very easy to say they're different species because they're very characteristic. So the English elm is our best well-known of these Ulmus minor. So this is, I think this on the left-hand side is an East Coker elm, or it's an Ulmus minor found in East Coker, and it's probably one of the biggest Ulmus minor in the country. It's not an English elm, but it's got some sort of resistance because it's been produced in the past by seed. So it is differentiated from the English elm. it's still there. It's amazing. It's an example of a field elm. These are typical flowers on an elm twig found in March, and then you've got the leaves here, which are varying in size. The size of the wych elm leaf is a lot bigger generally than the field elm. And the characteristic, this doesn't show it very well in this picture, but where the leaf meets the leaf stalk, it doesn't end in the same place. They're not regular. So one comes down closer to the stalk than the other one. You can see that the leaves are toothed. The teeth characteristics change, and that's another characteristic when you're trying to differentiate these trees. So that's the two that are found most widespread in the countryside, together with their hybrids. The white elm we'll see, is a fantastic tree. It's native in Europe, and it doesn't hybridize with anything else because it's in a different genus. It's been brought to Britain mostly as a parkland tree, and I'll show you some examples locally where they exist. People have misidentified this widely, and so they're still being, these huge trees the size of a beech are still being found. So this is an example in London of a white elm. They're quite an untidy looking tree, and one characteristic is they've got buttresses at the base of their trunk. And the other characteristic when they're in flower is they've got white flowers, and the whole tree looks like one vast chandelier. They're a magnificent looking tree. So this one is the one I've pictured, and this is the board that's with two stakes just below the tree. So this is a misidentification of a tree, of a white elm, and this is typical of how difficult they are to identify. But in this case, whoever identified it wasn't looking at the flowers. So it's not the rare Clemmer tree at all. So locally, I know a lot of you aren't locally, but this is just an example of how many trees are left. I don't know if we want to go through them, but it's just examples. These ones at Chitsgrove are by the Compasses pub, and they've survived because they're shaded by tall oak trees. There's some on the edge of the wood, but they're shaded out. And this is important because, as we come to see later, the beetles that spread the disease are very specific on how they infest a tree. So if they can't see the outline of that it's an elm tree, they don't feed on it, and they don't transfer the fungus. Grovely wood, we found the white letter hairstreak on these trees. Grovely wood is a vast wood, and we've only found 4 trees so far, and they're widely spread. And the Forestry Commission are planting resistant elms close to these surviving ones. Stapleford, there's one big elm tree. I've got a picture of it in a minute. And then alongside the A36, there's a forest of suckers. So there's quite a big colony of elm trees there. The small ones tend to get diseased, but this big one and several other slightly smaller ones do survive. In Smallbrook Meadows in Warminster, I identified a white elm, but there's also in the sort of the woodland area, there are some quite big field elms there, sort of hidden away. Gallows Hill, I don't know if many of you know this. This is on the Shaftesbury Drove Road, not far from Alverdiston, and there's a whole grove of small-leaved elms there. And there's one at Newtown near Tisbury, and a forester and a key naturalist, Keith Lee, showed me this only a year ago. It's been there for 100 years and no one else has seen it. It's just by the side of the road as you go into Newtown by the Newtown sign. Totterdale Farm, that's here. There's 3 huge trees just by the farm buildings. And they tend to come into leaf later than the ones I've got here. And maybe that's why they survive. The English elms all around Totterdale Farm are diseased and they don't grow very big. Winterbourne Stoke in the lay-by there's a whole forest of suckers along the A303, and there was one big tree. Now it's a skeleton, so that's again died. We'll see the tree I've got here. And if you go up to the Nadder Centre and walk into the community field, there's a whole line of quite, they're mature trees. They're more like the wych elm type. So they're smaller. So the Dutch elm is the cross between the field elm and the wych elm. And there's a good colony of white letter hairstreaks there too. So the 2 biggest, going on to white elms, the 2 biggest ones, there's 2 together in Sutton Venie, and right in the middle of a field. It used to be an old park, probably 120 years ago. The owner of the big house at Sutton Venie planted these 2 white elms together with the more normal clumps of beech. The other place, which is quite difficult to see them, and there's 50 here, planted by the ministry, is in Hexagon Wood at Lark Hill. And these are a different form than the Sutton Venie ones because they've been planted, I think, with lime trees. And so they've gone straight up and they're more like a plantation tree. And they've been planted on an old ammunition dump, which has been capped over by boulder clay. So white elms are a river tree, so it's very unusual to see them in this environment. Sutton Venie is more typical because it's on some gravels, so the water table is quite close. And then Siberian elm, this is just an example. There's a lot more planted near Andover by the Highways Authority. And this is by the Tithe Barn at Bradford-on-Avon. So I spotted this one when I was cycling along the towpath of the Kennet and Avon, and then went down to the Tithe Barn to have a look. And the Siberian elm is just by the small waterway there. The Siberian elm is only lives for about 60 years. It's quite an untidy tree. It doesn't really look like our native elms. So in the hybridization, you tend to try to breed more species than the Siberian elm to get away from the form of it. But it's very resistant elm. So this is examples of the type. So the white elm, you can't quite see the buttressing at the base. The twigs are very untidy. They sort of cross over, they dip and go a bit, so that's characteristic. The field elm, this is the staple, I think this is the one at Stapleford. It's along the footpath, I think it's a bridle way from Stapleford, opposite the village hall. This is Andrew Brooks by the Sutton Venie white elm. This is the Dutch elm at Winterbourne Stoke. So this one's just a skeleton now. This is it was fine last year, so I think Dutch elm disease has got it. And these are the suckers by the lay-by. This is the Siberian elm. So this is the one I brought back from Fritham. So this is at Woolmead Farm. So this is sort of typical of a wych elm, Dutch elm type. It's quite bushy, very large, smooth leaves. The bark is not terribly rough. I mean, I forgot to say the English elm, the bark is extremely rough, and that might be why the beetles go for it. But this, like I say, was planted in 1981. I planted 3 of these in the other corners of in 2 other corners of the field. The one on the left-hand side got Dutch elm disease and died. This other one died, but is coming back from suckers. So I've got the suckers in a tube, and we'll grow another tree from it. So this is very common with this, with both wych elm and Dutch elm, that they will regrow from their roots. So hardly any of these trees have actually died. They've 45 million trunks have died, but the trees themselves, it's very unusual to have actually one die, because they do regrow. So the disease itself has been around for thousands and thousands of years in Asia. So the elms in Asia, by and large, are immune, and they've got different strategies to counter the disease. In Europe, it was first identified in the 1920s, and this fungus was brought in, and it didn't. It's not as virulent as the one that came in the 1970s, and so it killed something like 20% of the elms in Europe. And this is when the first breeding programs for resistant elms started. The 1970s outbreak was brought in with rock elm from the United States and brought into a timber yard in Gloucestershire. So this disease, the Ulmi, had gone over to the United States and had changed in some way to the Nouveau Ulmi. And so the United States, their elms got, particularly the American elm, got nearly eradicated in many places. And this is by the smaller European elm bark beetle, Scolytus multistriatus. So this, in the United States, they've got their native bark beetle, and then this one was imported, and this one caused the damage to the American elms. So in Europe, we've got the two different types. And so the Scolytus is the one that caused most of the problems in the 1970s. It's a much larger beetle. I haven't got I thought I had a picture of it. Perhaps it's coming later. It's got a much larger probing proboscis, and so it can get much further into the Cambrian. So even the resistant elms that were planted in the 20s are not resistant anymore to this new disease with this beetle. So this is how I got very interested in the disease-resistant elms. So it's been said that the butterflies declined almost 93% because they need flowering elm to feed on. And they're very difficult to see. They do fly around the canopies, so it's worth looking for them. They're very similar to other hairstreak in their habit, but so they fly around at various times of the day. I think it's mid-morning and then again in mid-afternoon, typically. But they do come down, especially if there's bramble below the trees. And you can see the caterpillar is typical hairstreak type caterpillar. But the caterpillar emerges from its overwintered egg in sometime in March, and it has to find, or they normally find, a flower bud that's just opening, and they feed on the flower bud, and then when the leaf bud emerges, then they burrow into that. Let's go back. So I showed a slide of Semley Common with all those suckers in the hedge. Well, the white letter hairstreak has been found on Semley Common, which means that they can survive on suckers. So although they have declined, the situation is not as bad as declining by 93% by any means. The numbers have declined hugely, but probably the range hasn't. They're still in the environment, quite very widespread, but it's just very difficult to see them because their numbers have dropped. You can imagine the number of eggs laid on suckers is far less than big trees, and if those suckers get diseased, then all the caterpillars on those suckers, all those leaves die. So it's in trouble, but not as much as we thought. So going on to disease resistance. So this is where a lot of work, huge amount of work has been put in. So the Europeans have had the Netherlands have had a breeding program, the French and the Spanish and the Italians, and they approached it in different ways. The only way they could really do it was with the genetic resistance, and they've done that mostly by hybridization. The trees we see now, the big trees, are mostly resistant because of ecological resistance, which I'll come on to. So this, I'm sure all of you can add different reasons why there could be ecological resistance of these trees. So it's not known for sure which of these are the most important or which are affecting any tree, enabling it to survive. There's some cases which are proven. So in Brighton, there is the National Collection of Elms, and that's purely because of the sea, the isolation because of the sea and the hills, the downs to the north, the sea to the south. And when the disease does get in, when the beetles do attack, there's a very stringent biosecurity program, and so the diseased trees are cut down and they are burnt. In Scotland, above Edinburgh at the moment, but it's changing. There are still elms untouched by disease because the scolitis beetles, they're not there. They need to fly in temperatures above 18 degrees. And this might be linked to why there was such an outbreak in 1976. There's just far more days of high temperatures, enabling them to fly, enabling them to breed and to multiply. I've mentioned the shadow effect. This is the ones at Chicksgrove in the wood. Tree height. So if you get small trees, they don't get attacked, but trees grow, so that's not much of a deterrent. It's thought that the beetles, they're very, very fussy. They're very picky on what they attack. So if they've got a good food supply of English elm, then it's possible that other species, which might vary in leafing time or might look different, the beetles just pass them by time after time and they just survive. So the ones at Totterdale, they're tall trees amongst suckering English elm. They do leaf much later than English elm. It could be that. So tree maturity. So in the lecture from Brian Eversham, which I talked about, I talked about him in Cambridgeshire. He was saying that the reason that the Cambridge, Northampton, Bedfordshire counties have got so many elms is because they're all old and they're immune because of their age. So the young trees are dying around them, but the old trees are still there. And he put a proposal forward that the scolitis beetles, the big beetles, have run out of food and probably, and their numbers have decreased almost to nothing. So in France, only 1% of the beetles are scolitis. All the rest are the small bark beetle. But it's inexact science, and Andrew Brooks countered that by saying in the States they've only got the small bark beetle and all the trees died, most of the trees died there. So it's not really known why the Cambridgeshire elms are still there. So the salt winds don't favour the beetles, so there's quite a lot of elms left by the coast, on the coast. Again, it's not 100%, they still die there. There's thought that that drought has an effect, but some drought is better, I've heard it said. And because the beetles are looking for a particular type of tree, the ivy covering the trunk might discourage them. So again, that might be a reason why the Cambridgeshire elms have survived, because they look different, they're big, and they've got ivy. I should have said an ex member of our group was David Hurling, and he's got he had trials going, and he thought that the senility of the tree was important. So the old trees aren't growing very well. So the beetles attacking them on the leaf crotch at the top of the tree weren't interested in them because they didn't. There's only a very short new twig produced every year. So he thought the old trees were partly immune because of that. So we come on to genetic resistance. And so the main resistance that has been found has been these compounds of phenolic compounds. And so the tree produces these compounds, and it kills or it impacts on the fungus traveling through the xylem. And so they vary so the trees do vary in how much of these compounds they've got. And it could be that the Cambridgeshire elms have just got enough to form a little bit of resistance. So the white elm is an extraordinary situation where if you were to slip the bark and introduce the fungus, the tree is not immune. It would die within a year. It's very susceptible. But the beetle doesn't like it. It doesn't go. It doesn't. It finds it very distasteful because of the alulin in the bark. And it's got the Spanish breeding company have quantified how much anulin, and it's although the wych elm, for example, has got a tiny amount, the white elm's got 10 times the amount. So the sap, exuding the sap. So as soon as the Chinese elm is attacked, it exudes the sap, which actually it sort of locks up the beetle in this sappy sort of stuff, and it kills the beetle, so they don't get a chance to attack it. And so the type of bark is, we're going back onto the ecological resistance really. The elms do differ in their growth habit according to where they what soil type and how they're grown. So it could be that some elms are attacked less often because of their heavily ridged bark. So the two ways of getting resistant elms is either hybrids or purebreds. The vast majority are hybrids. Of all the breeding companies in Europe, they've all gone for hybrids bar one. This is a lutece growing in a garden in Tisbury, in the garden of a house called Elms, so they had to have an elm. This is lutece, which is bred initially by the Netherlands breeding company, and then when they closed that, I think it was the French took it over. And this is a one which we can get hold of here. Frank Matthews Nursery imports it. They sell it, but I also buy it from them to sell with the mixture. But so the hybrids, they come in all different hybridization parents. So the Chinese elm, the Himalayan elm, and the Siberian elm all can form complex parentage to produce elms which look something like our European elms. So they're hybridized with European elms, almost minor, and wych elm to make a tree that's resistant and looks a bit like or quite a lot like our European elms. The purebred trees, so in this country, the Forestry Commission didn't find any resistance in any tree that was sufficient to breed from. And that's been the same across Europe, where even in Spain, they've only found 0.5 of 1%, half of 1% of trees that showed enough resistance to go forward in the breeding program. So by and large, all the trees that are available are hybrids. The purebreds, there's only at the moment 7 types, and they're all bred by the UPM in Spain, the University Polytechnic in Madrid. And the one that's most interest is Adamus, which probably quite a few of you are familiar with. So of all the other 6 that they've got, they've genetically tested them, and they found a tiny quantity of Siberian elms genes. So Siberian elm has been planted widely in Spain, and by cross-pollination on these rare occasions has produced resistant trees. So they're all almost minor, but Adamus is the only one that is completely devoid of any other genes. So hybrids are suitable for many different situations, but they have got problems, and so you have to be careful where you use them, and every situation is different. So in Cambridgeshire, that in East Anglia, there's not very many grown because they've got their own, for whatever reason, they've got their own native elms surviving. But if you were to move those trees, those Cambridge elms, their progeny normally dies, and if you introduce the fungus into the bark, they die. So they're not, or they normally die. So then there's something very strange going on we can't account for. The importation is always a problem. We don't really want to import them, but it's only very small quantities. So we're trying not to do that. We're trying to propagate our own. The ways to do it are the ways to propagate any trees really. We've tried hardwood, softwood cuttings and root cuttings. In my mind, the hardwood cuttings are the easiest. I'll go into that if there's questions. Seeds from white elm are pure white elm because they can't pollinate with anything else. But the seeds of any other elm will be probably pollinated by a different species. So most of the seeds produced by wych elm will not produce pure wych elm plants anymore. They'll be crosses with whatever's in the vicinity. Micropropagation. So this is how the Europeans produce a lot of their their resistant material. So this is how Adamus is produced, and it's a way of not introducing any viruses, any pests, anything with the new plant. So this is slides from Madrid, the Madrid breeding company. So I don't think I'll go through it, but it's all produced. The new trees are planted on an agar plate. They're treated with a few plant hormones to produce the trees, and then they go on to produce trees as you would normally. This is a map which my partner has produced, and she's worked on all of these slides, so she's the graphic designer. So thank you. But she is Spanish, so I haven't changed this around. But you can see the interest in these elms is very widespread all over the country. This one in Wales was this year, and it was a highways project. So they bought 300 or so Adamus to plant for their living corridor project. I've sold to schools. This is Gillingham School here. Also sold them to the Forestry Commission. So this was a couple of years ago. This is Fuente, which is a German produced hybrid. It was produced as a timber tree. So they planted these 100 trees here. So I've finished the talk really. So this is a few references and reading. There's a lot on the web. This is the Andrew Brooks one, the disease-resistant elm cultivars report. So this is very, very comprehensive, and it shows you where you can buy the sources of resistant elms. Future trees. This was a very important report last year, and this is leading on to more research. So if you get a chance, read this one. The Barn Club is a book which I've got here. It's a really good book. It's all about the culture of trees. So it goes on. It goes all about elms in Hertfordshire, and making the whole process in making them into a traditional barn. But I would recommend that for all sorts of reasons. And then if you want some in-depth reading, this book called Elms by R.H. Richins. He was one of the authorities in the 20th century with a guy called Melville, and they fought like cats and dogs over species, what's the species and what isn't. And they produced some very good science.
Thank you to Peter Shallcross for presenting this talk as part of the Spring Talk series, hosted by the Chase Chalke Landscape Partnership scheme. Thank you to our partners and funders for this talk. The Chase Chalke Landscape Partnership is a group of organisations working together to protect and enhance the special landscape of Cranborne Chase and the Chalke Valley. With Cranborne Chase AONB as the lead partner, and with support from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, this 5-year partnership is working with local communities to better connect people with the landscape. For more information, please visit www.cranbornechase.org.uk.